Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Carolyn McVean and I'm your parliamentary librarian. I've got this written down so I remember who I am. Firstly, on behalf of the Parliament of Victoria, its members and staff, we acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we gather today. We pay our respects to them, their culture, their elders past, present, and we also pay our respects to people from First Nation communities who may be joining us today. I welcome you to our seminar about scientific literacy in an era of misinformation, which we're presenting jointly with ATSI, which is the Australian Academy of Technology and Engineering. Our moderator today is Professor Sandra Kentish, who is the chair of the ATSI Victorian Division Committee, and Redmond Barry, Distinguished Professor with the University of Melbourne. Before we start, just so when we get to question time, we do have another microphone for you. I'll hand over now to Sandra, who will start the presentation.
And the famous click.
And I forgot, it does. There we go. I'll go this way. So
You're right. Thank you, Caroline, and welcome everyone to this first seminar, Science and Technology seminar for 2025. And as Caroline mentioned, our focus today is scientific literacy in an era of misinformation. Why is this such an important topic? I think you're all aware that there are so many sources today where we can access our information. And many of us expect, and some of us will never question, that these sources can be trusted. But can they be trusted? And if they can't, what are the consequences? Not just for ourselves, but for our children, for our elders, and for those to whom we're responsible. So these are the questions we'll be exploring in our expert panel. We have two very highly distinguished speakers with us today, and I'll introduce both of them to you now. So our first speaker will be Professor Karen Verspoor. Karen is Dean of the School of Computing Technologies at RMIT University, and she's also the Victorian Node Lead and co-founder of the Australian Alliance for Artificial Intelligence in Health, and she's also an ATSI Fellow. She's made outstanding contributions in Australia and the US through her use on the research of the use of artificial intelligence methods to enable biological discovery and clinical decision support. Notably, in November 2024, Karen participated in a science misinformation roundtable chaired by the then Chief Scientist, Dr. Cathy Foley. Our second speaker is Misha Ketchell. Misha is a journalist for more than 25 years and is currently the editor and executive director of The Conversation Australia and New Zealand. He was the founding editor of The Big Issue Australia and editor of Crikey, The Reader and The Melbourne Weekly. In other roles, he's been a reporter and feature writer at The Age and worked at the ABC as a TV producer on Media Watch and The 7:30 Report. Misha has a Juris Doctor from RMIT and a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Melbourne. So I'll now hand over to our first speaker, Karen Verspoor.
Thank you so much, Sandra. So hello, everybody. I think it's my job to set a little bit of context around this question, and then Misha will take over and hopefully give you some idea of how we can move forward from this situation. So first, we always have to start with definitions, particularly when we're talking about law and government. We need to know what we're talking about. So when we're talking about misinformation, there's actually two types of misinformation that we are typically thinking about. Obviously, misinformation is misleading content of some type, typically not conforming to what we understand as truth, whatever that might be. But there's also disinformation, which is content that is intentionally false. So content that's fabricated, which creates a lack of understanding and places that false information out into the world. So once this misinformation or disinformation gets out into the world, we see people believing it. And I think it poses this question of why do people believe in mis or disinformation, and indeed, why do they perpetuate it? We've all seen it happening, that there is information that gets out there that we know is wrong, and particularly in science, this impacts our climate change paradigm, it impacts health information. There's an incredible amount of wrong information that people believe. And I think there's a number of explanations for that. One is that people don't have scientific literacy. They don't have a way to actually judge the quality of the information that they're seeing. Partly maybe because they don't know enough about the topic to even know what questions to ask or whether the assumptions that are built into that information are valid or not. But also, actually, we have limited access to credible sources. I mean, the most credible sources for science are in the scientific literature. And actually, most of that information is not written with the general public in mind. It's written at a level, and again, based on background knowledge, which the typical member of the public would not be able to understand. Even the writing level is not at an appropriate level for people who maybe have a year 10 education to understand. I personally shifted from computer science into biomedicine, and I found the first time I tried to read an article about protein function, honestly, it was like reading Russian, it made no sense at all to me. So that's a problem. And one of the key factors that we're seeing is mistrust. We just don't trust the sources of information that we have. We don't trust the people who are telling us things. And that can be either the truth or the misinformation. We end up not trusting anybody. That's the bottom line. And so it creates confusion and people don't know what to trust. So where does this mis or disinformation come from? Well, there's a number of sources of it. As I said, there could be intentional introduction of false information. We might call that through bad actors, like people who want for some motivation to put information out there that's misleading people. But there is also bad science. And so we have in this overall environment the situation that there are people who are having research that doesn't meet the standards of science. And one hopes this gets filtered out through processes like peer review. But we know because there are retracted articles, and I should be clear, the level of low science quality in Australia is extremely low. However, globally, there are factors, and it's not zero in Australia either. And so we need to be looking out for people who are putting science out that wasn't based on a sound experimental method, wasn't actually removed from the peer review process, removed from the literature, and in fact, may be put out there before it's had any kind of vetting or review, particularly through some of our open sources of information, such as arXiv or medRxiv. These are preprint publications where scientists can just upload an article that hasn't been reviewed. Then we have misleading science communication that actually plays a part in this. So if a scientist puts an article that hasn't been peer reviewed up on arXiv, then a member of the media might pick it up and start telling that story. And so this is the beginning of a process where bad information starts spreading. And if people don't have a framework for saying, no, I don't believe this information, or they don't have a source which counters that information that they also trust, then that perpetuates the cycle. So this all sits within a complex ecosystem that starts with misinformation or disinformation, but gets amplified because of some of the factors that are happening more broadly in the fabric of our society. So we have, of course, the role of social media and digital platforms in this. This is a very rapidly changing environment, and Misha will touch on this more shortly. But mistrust is also grounded in the fabric of our society. You know, it's sort of, who do we trust? Who is a credible information source? And when people are not feeling that they're integrated into the society, then they're more vulnerable to listening to sources that maybe they shouldn't be trusting. And it appears that this problem of misinformation and believing misinformation and spreading misinformation is getting worse. Why might that be? Well, we've heard recently that Facebook has decided to stop doing any kind of fact-checking. So there are questions around whose job it is to ensure that the integrity of information that's out there and available to people is reliable. Is it Facebook's job to do that? I think they've decided that it's not. Is it the peer review process job to remove bad science from the scientific literature? Whose job is it? Well, that's something we need to deal with, because if nobody is checking it and nobody is vetting it, then we're going to have some bad information getting out there. We also have muddled and biased sources of information. I won't ask for a show of hands, but I'm going to guess that some of you use ChatGPT as a source of information. And that's probably okay if you're talking about basic facts that have been well established and have been repeated over and over and over again. But it actually mingles together a huge amount of information, not just from reliable scientific sources, but also from Reddit or from blogs. And all of that information gets merged together. How do we unpick whether the information that's being generated by a system like ChatGPT is true or not? There's no way to even go back and see what the sources of that information were. We have echo chambers that are being reinforced by social media, people sharing information with people who share the same mistrust or lack of understanding of the information, and they just perpetuate this. We have scientists withdrawing from the process of trying to block bad information because they're being harassed on social media platforms. We have generative AI as a contestable information source. Like I said, is it true or not, the information that's coming out of a system like ChatGPT? How do we tell? We don't know where it came from. And interestingly, we now have seen generative AI being used to create scientific outputs. So there are tools out there based on AI that do the entire scientific process, including brainstorming, writing the code to run experiments, analyzing the data, and writing the paper, and in fact doing its own peer review. The entire cycle. What does that mean for the quality of the scientific information that is getting out there into the world? Okay, so how do we move forward from this? I think we really need to work on that ecosystem. We need to build trust in science. We need to build trust in scientists. We need to think about that, developing that critical thinking around scientific information and building both the scientific literacy, but also the digital literacy and the AI literacy of the community, so that people understand that not everything they see online is true. And we need to amplify reliable information sources. So give people some direction onto who they should trust and where that information where information that they should trust is coming from. And so I will leave it there because we will have, oops, I went the wrong direction, some more thoughts from Misha on this. For now, thank you.
Thanks, Karen, and thanks everybody for coming today. I just need to work out how I actually move these slides. Is that how it works? Okay, good, excellent. I think what I want to address my comments today to is the question of the intersection of expert knowledge, which Karen just spoke about, scientific expertise and the public discourse, because I think that's an area where there's a real problem. To give you an example of why it's a real problem, I'd like to talk about a paper that was released in 1998. Some of you might have heard of a very famous paper by a doctor by the name of Andrew Wakefield. which alleged that there was a link between vaccines, MMR vaccines, and autism. That paper was in the British journal Lancet. It was retracted and found to be fraudulent. But the information in that paper has persisted to this day and continues to circulate and continues to influence people to adopt attitudes towards vaccines that are perfectly safe, that, in my view, are detrimental to their health. So the reason that this issue matters so much, and it's so important to get it right, is that the media ecosystem, the information system, ecosystem that we swim in, has a whole range of impacts for the decisions we make in our lives, for the political decision-making process, for our individual health, for the health of society. Unfortunately, the news I'm here to give you today is that I think our information ecosystem is in real trouble, and we're facing a lot of very significant threats to do with the sorts of things that Karen touched on, to do with AI, to do with algorithms, to do with social media, and to do with people's habits of the ways in which they consume information and the difficulties of differentiating reliable quality information from information that is not reliable. One of the things that people who have a vested interest in, for example, opposing systems of categorising knowledge or understanding knowledge in terms of hierarchies, one of the things that they will do is sometimes dismiss particular sources. So, for example, Donald Trump said, the New York Times was fake news. My view personally is that, say, a newspaper like the New York Times is flawed. It publishes things that are inaccurate, it publishes things that are incorrect, it can be critiqued. But I think it is a qualitatively different type of information than, say, a tweet or a blog or something you might see on YouTube. The difficulty we've got is that we're now all living in an information economy where all of those distinctions are flattened out. In fact, they're not even visible to you. One of the things that I've done working at The Conversation, which I should say the work that we do is taking academic expertise and trying to translate it for a general audience. Part of the work that I've been involved in is having negotiations and discussions with Facebook and Google as part of a federal government project called the News Media Bargaining Code, in which the platforms were paying some media providers money for their journalism. And one of the things that we were saying constantly to Google was, when you produce a search result, what signals do you give to the audience about the quality of the different types of information you get in your answers? So what is a systematic review? What is a journal article? What is a media article? Because these things actually matter for people. They need to be able to distinguish what to trust and what not to trust. Google has had very little interest in doing that. I think most of the digital media companies, the platforms, have actually done a very bad job of that. So what we have now is we have AI, which is a sea of poorly sourced information, and we have systems presenting us information where it's entirely bereft of context. So in the old days, you'd get a newspaper and you might trust this newspaper, or you might listen to this particular radio station, or you had... When you came across information, it would be in a context where you would know the extent to which you can trust it. Now information comes at you in a range of ways where it's stripped away from the context, it's stripped away from the information about who provides it, about what expertise is feeding into it. And we've become used to filtering information and prioritising information based upon what many people have termed the attention economy, which is this idea that basically all information is a beauty pageant, and whatever is the most sensational and the most interesting and whatever can sort of gain your attention wins. That's a real problem for having an informed public discussion about the things that matter. And it seems to me, based on all of the evidence we can see about what's happening in the media, that this problem is only getting worse. And it's a problem we really need to think about how we're going to solve this so we can actually have a public discourse that is well informed, where people know what information to trust and they can make informed decisions. I'm just going to go through, I did prepare a few slides, and I just want to go through them really quickly just to give you a bit of a sense of what's happening in the media world currently. So This is from a presentation that Nick Newman gave to the Alliance for Journalist Freedom in the latter half of last year, and it's based on the Reuters Digital News Report. Again, sources are always important in these things. Basically, what it's showing you is where people are getting their news and information from, and you can see TV news is really in serious decline. This is a big problem they're facing at the ABC. You can see that social media has been fairly stable. Print newspapers are massively in decline. You can see also, online overall as a source is also fairly flat. One of the really interesting things is none of these. One of the things the Reuters Digital News Report is tracking is the extent to which there is a cohort of people who are deliberately avoiding news, either sometimes or all of the time. I think for the under 25 age group, something like 39% of people are actively avoiding news altogether. Again, that's a problem in terms of people who aren't reading newspapers, if they're not accessing quality sources, say in broadcast media or other quality sources. The question is, where are they getting their news and what information are they basing their decisions on? Trust in news, downward trend, it's been bad. I think we all know this. Trust in institutions generally has been bad. Trust in politicians, any politicians in the room today will understand that that's also been a problem. Partly this relates to this idea that in a world in which people are getting their information in an attention economy and it's about how it makes you feel, feelings win. And so, for example, types of content that reflect the way that people feel will be popular. There's a media academic in the United States called Ethan Zuckerman who wrote a terrific book that was published not long before the January 6th insurrection in the US. And the book actually talked about this idea of the public sphere being divided up into two types of people. He said there are insurrectionists, and basically they're people who think that the systems that we've got in our society are fatally flawed and they want to tear it down. It's sort of the drain the swamp crowd, it's the Doge crowd, it's the people that say our institutions are serving us poorly. And Ethan Zuckerman goes to great pains to say there is something to that argument. There are definitely problems with our institutions, but it's not clear that the solution is just tearing them down. He talks about another group called institutionalists, who are people who are trying to work to rebuild trust in institutions, whether they be, democracy, political institutions, universities, things like scientific method, journal articles, those sorts of things, where you can actually have genuine hierarchies of meaning. And I think when we're talking about the problem of disinformation, again, it's about trust. And that trust is important in the context of people being able to differentiate what they can and can't trust and understand what's behind the information that they're consuming. So I'm just going to whip through these really quickly because I do want to get to questions. In Australia, 75%, I think, of people are concerned about misinformation from the Reuters Digital News Report. Now, just quickly, a little bit about the conversation. The conversation was set up in Melbourne in 2011. It exists to try to fight the misinformation by injecting reliable information into the public sphere. We work only with academics like Karen, who are experts in their field. In fact, we're chasing Karen to write an article for us right now on AI and medical research. And the idea that sort of sits behind the work that we're doing is a lot of people have proposed problems for the misinformation in the public sphere. I think most of the solutions that people have proposed are ineffective. One of the solutions that Google and the digital platforms like to put forward is this idea of digital literacy. You teach young people how to differentiate fact from fiction. But the truth is, Google doesn't provide the tools. The digital literacy programs that exist will educate, 1 in 100 kids. And the metaphor that I use is it's like having a car production line where you're producing, 100 cars an hour. You know that 7 of those cars in any given hour are going to have brakes that don't work. And rather than fixing the brake system, what you do is you say, I'm going to go out and educate 1 in 100 of my consumers so they can tell which car's brakes won't work. That's basically what we're getting when people talk about digital literacy. It's not going to be a complete solution. Interestingly, the AEC is working on this in the context of the upcoming election, running a campaign to people saying stop and check information. I think it's really well intentioned. I don't see how that can actually be effective. The other thing that a lot of people have put time and effort into is fact checking. You've probably all heard about ABC RMIT fact check and different fact checking teams. I think it's really problematic, because fact-checking tends to reinforce the idea that information is partisan. The people who are fact-checked hate it and continue to believe what they believed. The right just go, yes, this information was wrong, but you end up sort of preaching to the choir. And there's interesting research that says that fact-checking's ability to actually change people's minds when they're confronted with misinformation is fairly limited. It has a role. I don't think it's, without use, but it's something that we really need to think about how effective it can be. I'm just going to rush through very quickly. So what we're trying to do is inform public policy with good quality information. Part of that is something that the conversation does, which is try to surface to audiences the things that tell you what you can trust and what you can't. So we have very rigorous retraction and correction processes. People really find, I think, some value in that. We have disclosure statements from academics if they've got conflicts of interest. These are the sorts of things you really need to know and be armed with to distinguish what information you can trust and what information you can't. I'm going to leave it there, apart from just saying one other thing, which is at the moment we're really obviously gearing up for the federal election and focusing on public policy and trying to create an evidence base so we can have a discussion about some of the issues that we're facing that is more informed and less infected by information that you can't trust. So I'll leave it there and then we can have questions later on. But thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Misha. I'll just wrestle this out because Jeffrey told me I would. The floor is open for questions. I have some here, but we'll just see first if there's a burning question from our audience. No specific ones. We'll let you warm up. So perhaps to both of you, aside from the conversation and, of course, from the Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering, where do people go should people go for trusted sources of information? Where does a politician or a member of the public should go?
Want me to start? Yeah. So, a lot of science lives in the scientific literature, so that's a core resource. But of course, as I said earlier, it's often very inaccessible. There are a number of magazines, and journals that try to put information out that is a little bit more news-like. So including Nature, for example, they have Nature News and Views, where they have kind of shorter summaries or commentaries of science that's emerging. There are magazines. There are some fantastic science journalists out there. I personally read The Atlantic. I learn a lot from The Atlantic about scientific issues. I'm sure Misha has better suggestions than mine, but I think we need to be looking at media and at the science, the basis in science itself.
Yeah, so I also enjoy The Atlantic, but I think the problem is trying to get that quality information to people who wouldn't get it otherwise, who wouldn't seek it out and wouldn't know how to seek it out. I'm thinking of the under 25-year-olds, for example, who are not watching broadcast news, they're not reading newspapers, they're growing up in a world of information which is pretty dodgy. One of the things that we do, just to be a little bit self-promotional for a moment, is when an academic has a new journal article coming out, we always encourage them to write an article in the conversation, and we sort of say to them, basically, that acts as an ad for the journal article. The journal article itself might be written in a way that's hard to read or hard to access, but our articles, we aim for a reading age of an educated 16-year-old. We use this thing called the Flesch-Kincaid Index, which tells you how many words there are in a sentence, whether your language is sort of clear, whether you have sort of the right prose to actually make something really accessible. And we actually have a traffic light system for academics where it's green, yellow and red. So Karen, you might have had that experience where you submit an article, it comes in red, and then we change all of the prose to sort of make it accessible. So that's one thing that we're doing at the conversation. I worry. I think there's a real problem. I mean, there's things like the Daily Oz, which does some pretty good explanatory journalism. But apart from people who are very literate already and know how to access the sources, I think a lot of people are swimming in a quite infected pool of misinformation.
Thank you. I'm going to again pause to see there's a question there.
Thank you. My name is Gavin. Full disclosure, I'm a libertarian, so I believe in free speech, but I also believe in science, so interested to be here. One of the things you said, Misha, was I believe that misinformation is getting worse because I read it in the paper all the time, and that sort of let off an alarm bell to me because it's in their interests to put a lid on social media, and it's also in yours, I might add, that being concerned about misinformation is great for the conversation and for your funding. Have you got any... When you talk about trust, that sort of was an alarm bell. I think you and the media might have a financial reason to believe that. So.
Yeah, look, the first thing is I think what you say is true. It's absolutely right. I mean, obviously, I'm part of a media organisation and we have an interest in selling our wares and getting people to read our content. I think also, as a libertarian, there's a point you're making which actually is quite important, which is the digital revolution has democratised access to information and access to communication in a way that's really important. I mean, the old media that we had didn't always serve us well. There were people whose voices weren't heard. There were people who were cut out of public discourse. There were people who couldn't reach each other and talk to each other. It's not all bad. But what I am saying is that hierarchy of being able to differentiate what information you can trust and what information you can't is really not visible to people now. And the risk is on something like the intersection of AI and medical expertise, I'd want to listen to Karen, not to me, right? Now, if I post something on that, I get the same weight as her, and she's got a whole lifetime of research expertise in that I don't have. And I think that's important. And there's a real sort of anti-expert sentiment in society at the moment. I get it, I understand it. But it's a problem because it means that we can't actually build on existing knowledge. It holds us back, I think.
If I can also add, I think, we have to decide at some point that there is something that is true. There are facts that are true. And the way we do that is through the scientific process, by generating evidence to either support or not the particular hypotheses and conclusions. And so science itself is all about trying to generate evidence for truth. It's not a subjective thing. You can believe the output of a scientific process or not. That's a choice you can make. But the process itself is done with the intention of adding to knowledge and information and to generate facts. How do we know that a particular genetic mutation causes a disease? We know that because we've done experiments that demonstrate statistically that there is an association between that genetic mutation and the disease. And at some point, things become sort of indisputable facts.
Do we have any other burning questions? The burning light. Up the front there, yeah. Oh, you can go, yes, and then up the front, yeah.
Hi, my name's Alicia White. I was interested in that graph you had, Misha, which had the press and TV news going down, social media flat. There was something else that was flat at the top, and then digital. And then along the bottom, the line that was coming up was young people that got their information from no source. Well, they're not is it that they're not attributing it to any of those? So I guess my question is, are those people sort of just disconnecting? Is the world too horrible, too hard, are they just opting out? Or do you think they're just getting it, I don't know, word of mouth, or where could they be getting their information
It's
from?
really interesting, actually. People are placing their trust in people, not processes. So people don't trust, say, the New York Times, because you can show that the New York Times has got something wrong, but you can also show that scientific journals have got things wrong. There have been papers that have been retracted. Like, every process is imperfect. But what's happened is people see the imperfections of the processes and go, well, I don't trust that. And what they're turning to is people. So it's sort of this idea of influencers, for example. Like, I will trust... There's separate work that the Reuters Digital News does on who people do trust and how they place their trust, and it's friends, it's networks, it's influencers, it's a Joe Rogan, it's somebody with whom you can spend a lot of time. And again, this is something that's really hard for people who are interested in hierarchies of knowledge like we are, which is sort of saying that, I mean, I actually think that Kim Williams, the chair of the ABC, was very critical of Joe Rogan recently, and I think mistakenly so. I think people who have genuine curiosity and engage with audiences online should be respected. But I also think we need to insist upon different processes of knowledge sorting, because I think people just sharing stuff is not enough to guarantee good information.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add is we have in science a notion of levels of evidence. Misha alluded to it earlier, things like systematic reviews being more reliable than, say, an individual case study. And so even within science, we have these gradations of quality. And part of the process of science is to weed out the lower quality things, or to reinforce the findings of results so that we can come to some higher level conclusions. And so we need to also, even within science, things can go wrong, and one case study does not mean that something holds for the whole population. And so we need to communicate that. But people, I think, are just burying their head in the sand. It's too much.
Thank you. To what extent do you think the way we fund science impacts the quality of science that we're getting?
Yeah, I mean, funding is a tricky thing because all research requires funding in order to happen. We need to support the ecosystem, but funding is inevitably strategic, right? We have government setting policies or setting directions around. Well, we want to invest in AI research, or we want to invest in quantum. And when we do that, we're making a choice to not invest in some other kinds of science. And so there's an inevitable sort of direction in which scientists go, because they follow the money. It's like, well, if I'm not going to get funding to research my favorite cats, then I'm going to go in a direction where the funding is. And of course, there's funding from private sources as well, which also directs us. But hopefully, those are still problems that matter and are of public importance. I have done work with publishers, in fact, to try to help them accelerate the way that they can disseminate information. That's funded by a publisher. Yes, they have a vested interest in their business model of doing that. However, it's also something that will allow them to provide better services to their customers, and so that then benefits the customers. We have to look at that, though, and that's also why the conversation says, what are your sources of funding? But it's not necessarily bad that we get funding from particular sources. We just need to understand, whether the process that's being done in the science is sound.
No.
I might intervene here and build on a question you just had, which was at times a politician or one of their staff members may want to go to an individual, bypass some of these issues with these sources and go directly to a scientist. So a double-barreled question: how do they go about accessing the right scientist, and how does the scientist build trust, build a profile, if you like, that allows them to be trusted?
That's a big one. have to start? Well, I mean, it's actually really hard, Sandra. You know, there's a lot of noise out there, and you know, you've heard that my expertise is AI in health, particularly natural language processing, and I kind of joke always that nobody knew what natural language processing was until ChatGPT was unleashed onto the world. Even my dad rang me up and said, "Hey, so this ChatGPT thing, that's a little bit like what you do, right?" Yes, Dad, exactly. It only took you 30 years, but anyway, yeah. So how do you do that? I mean, we have trouble being visible to our colleagues, let alone to the real world. And I mean, you know, academia is not the real world, obviously. So, I mean, one way I've tried to do that is just by writing in the conversation, you know, get some of my knowledge out in a public forum. I also do a lot of public speaking. That's how we do it. We just get out there and start talking and, you know, doing forums like this, answering questions, helping to guide people on the basis of the knowledge that we have.
Yeah. I don't actually have much expertise to add on this question apart from just the basic journalistic process, the way that I would always work, which is if I want to find an expert on large language models, for example, I would look at an expert guide from any of the universities. I'd bring up somebody who has expertise in that area. They might say to me, "I'm not the right person, I don't know about this, but so-and-so is the right person." And eventually you get to them. You can see very quickly within a field who is trusted, who is cited, who is respected by other experts, and you can find that person. It doesn't really take very long. Again, just to promote the conversation for 1 minute, there are a lot of academics who are writing in plain language ways on a range of topics, so you can find people there as well. But I would always ask around a few academics to find who they think is the best person in an area.
And I would just add, of course, you can always go to the Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering and they will direct you to a fellow who has been elected by their peers as being an expert in that field. So, again, that provides a trusted source. But there's a question there.
And I'd just like to add to that, I'm with the library here. Your libraries, your local community libraries are a great starting point for people who want to know about a subject to get good factual information. And I would suggest for members of Parliament funding for school libraries and getting kids back into information literacy classes to begin with so that they can start looking at, well, is this true or is this not true? Where am I getting this information from?
Thank you. We have time for one more burning question, if there is one.
Tim?
I can't help listening to this, just thinking we need more kids studying science at secondary level to develop a trust for science. I'd be interested in comments from the panel.
Yeah, we definitely, I would say it's actually broader than just science. It's also, as I mentioned, digital literacy that I think is really important because the world has changed. And, you know, it's not enough just to know some basic facts in biology and chemistry and physics and mathematics. It's also understanding how you build on that understanding in order to critically read information and even knowing what sources it's coming from, right? So just knowing that you shouldn't just trust every piece of science that you see or that you hear about on TikTok or wherever is step one. And we need to be building that in, I would argue, from primary school. You know, asking people, what did you hear yesterday? What are your parents talking about? Oh, where do you think that comes from? You know, kind of putting news as an item that is under regular discussion.
Yeah. The only thing I'd add to that, I think, it's sort of interesting. There was something that came out this week, some research into civics knowledge that sort of showed there was a decline, and there's been a call for schools to increase, you know, civics education. I'd say schools can lay a foundation, but the difficulty is that it's that sort of idea of like lifelong education. You need then to have like a media ecosystem that continues to bring you quality information and keep you engaged and keep you up to date through your life. And I think media that does educative work, if you think of, years ago, the old broadsheet newspapers or, serious documentaries on, public broadcasters like the ABC or SBS, you can see that that's taking a decreasing part of people's lives. And so that's a problem. So you have to find ways of continuing to provide that sort of things that reinforce that sort of literacy after school as well as at school.
Thank you, Misha. And of course, that was a really good Dorothy Dixer for me to finish my presentation, because I wanted to add that the Academy has recently released a report. There's copies of this at the back, specifically about the need to increase science education in Victoria at both primary and secondary school levels. We're completely lagging in the number of science lessons we provide in primary school behind states such as Queensland, and there's data to support that. So I would encourage you to read this. We've put in there 4 recommendations we'd like to see implemented to increase science education in Victoria. But I have reached our time limit. I'm conscious the bells might ring. So if we can thank our speakers one more time, to Karen and to Misha. They will be hanging around for a few minutes after the event if you'd like to talk to them personally. But thank you very much.